Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the Debbie Does Dallas of extreme metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka forcing the employee at Guitar Center to get the most expensive Gibson Les Paul off the wall so I can play Von riffs at a deafening volume on a Spider Line 6 practice amp.
Sounds great. And I am the black metal guy, aka Bog Mutton.
A gamey meat indeed.
Yes, a peasant delicacy.
Well, is that gator meat? Because we were talking about gators before we got in. Bog mutton would be a good name for that.
That's true. Well, to qualify as bog mutton, it actually has to have been seasoned in a bog for at least 3 seasons.
I mean, aren't you just describing the British diet in general at that point?
Yeah, basically.
All right, back from spring break. How was yours?
Oh, I got literal COVID.
Yeah, just like over winter break, I got COVID. It was your time.
Yeah.
What version did you get?
I got the Mecha Ghidorah strain.
Well, no, it was actually Delta, wasn't it?
I don't know. I didn't check. I tested positive a couple times, and it lingered. It was lingered for an annoyingly long amount of time. About I was visiting my girlfriend, and we both got it. Of course, who would I rather have COVID with? But it was, it stuck around for a long time for both of us. The most annoying part was just being tired.
Yeah.
But yeah, I never, checked the version, and I would have had to, check the news to figure out what strain it was supposed to be.
Well,
it seemed more persistent than Delta.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can tell, because Delta's more of a body high, and Omicron's a little bit more trippy and mental,
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that was a fucking delayed forced laugh there. Well, I'm great. I'm glad we're back. Okay, so we gotta get back into this shit. Episode 89. Big things coming, folks. Lots of big records coming down the pipe, but we got some smaller releases this time that'll still hopefully whet the appetites of everyone for things to come. So to start off, a little mini review up front. Last year, we covered the 4th full-length record by a band called Luminous Veil. It was called Vespers for the Lumen Lane. And that was kind of an oddball, mostly post-black metal band that had a lot of other interesting features, a lot of kind of traditional doom stuff going on melodically, some electronic stuff. It was pretty interesting, and they kind of caught the attention of some of our listeners, especially in the Discord. So they've done a couple EPs this year, but I wanted to talk quickly about the newest one called Halcyon Tyrannous, which is released on Wilt-Shine, which I think is their imprint. I'm not positive, but it's out of Wisconsin, like Luminous Veil. Wilt-Shine has also released actually some stuff from other bands that we've covered on the show. Like they did the cassette version of the Vixenta Ullcrossed split. Luminous Veil did a split with a band called Till and Oppressive Descent last year. So that was also released on Wilt-Shine. But now we've got a Halcyon Tyrannous. So I decided to check this one out because I thought that record last year was pretty interesting. I mean, this is a band that's only been around for a few years, and they put out a lot of material, so it's interesting to check back with guys like that and see how they iterate on the sound. So this is about half an hour long. A good chunk of it is dedicated to a pretty nifty sort of synth ambient track, but of course that's impossible to sample, so I'll just say it's good and we'll move on from there. But as far as the black metal material goes, it was pretty interesting to listen to this in contrast with the Vespers record from last year. Vespers was almost kind of deliberately clean and sterile. Very very mechanized, very music of the internet age in a way.
Yeah, very aggressively digital production, right?
Yeah. Halcyon Tyrannous is way gloomier and more lo-fi and more blown out with reverb and delay. So it's a huge shift in just kind of sound presentation. Materially, the building blocks of these songs are pretty similar to what we heard on Vespers, but the production and the execution of them is so radically different, it gives it an altogether pretty different vibe. Now, in terms of describing how it comes off, it's just because it's so blown out, you get more of a sense of post-black or kind of Instagram tape black. But the actual material is, yeah, there's the post-black in there, but the other thing is that Luminous Veil are really good at just writing solid, kind of traditional black metal riffs as well, and, just adding some of their own novel ideas into some of these songs. So let's listen to the second track on this record called Pine, which is my favorite. We'll listen to a chunk of that. So what you're going to hear is, extremely indulgent sort of post-rock derived melodic ideas, but they kind of go so far with them, they come out the other side as a sort of like almost summoning style triumphant melodies executed over blast beats with a lot of really chiming synth patches that makes me wonder if they're actually listening to Molder Yawn, who we've covered a couple records from. So we'll check this one out. So I really like that section because, they're using some of the most kind of, like, intensely sweet post-rock melodies, but the way they arrange it, just kind of the way they're paced out, sort of re-injects those into a kind of, like, actual black metal structural conceit. This is post-black in the sense that, obviously you've got this tremendous influence from, all sorts of, like, rock subgenres, but the way these songs are delivered and the way riffs are structured and the way things get laid out is, I think, actually closer to traditional black metal than a lot of the post-black bands are. Yeah,
I mean, I basically liked that, I have to say.
I'm genuinely surprised. I thought you were going to fucking hate this.
I hated the last one. I remember. I really didn't like the last record. I remember it had some moments of quite like good and interesting, kind of elaborate doom riffing, but the production was kind of interfering with it.
I gotcha. Yeah.
But this one is. This feels more straight ahead in a lot of ways. It's not. The last one felt very deliberately eccentric. Passages like this, at least, feel, that's a fully developed sequence of ideas that is much closer to just, like, streaming black metal guitar. Chord-wise, they're post-rock chords. It's a little like Mogwai or something. But, but also a bit like, I don't know, something like A Pregnant Light. Or a bit like Winterfilleth.
Yeah, the biggest kind of most major key moments of Winterfilleth, definitely.
The most lush, sentimental moments on Winterfilleth when they actually pull it off.
Yeah, which can be hit or miss, depending on the record.
Yes, the parts I don't... Yes, sometimes they do that and I hate it. Sometimes they do that and it really sort of wins me over. And I found this, honestly, pretty winning. It was kind of a feel-good hit of the summer kind of vibe. Part of that is the continually high intensity, right? It's pretty fast-picking. They're also just, like, good versions of those chords, and they're not... The black metal stuff is all in the arrangement and delivery. As far as the chording, there's... Well... It's like he's... In a post-rock context, a lot of those melodies would be delivered as more individual single-note melodic lines. Or with arpeggios or something like that. There's sort of body in the chords under them that is more of a black metal thing.
Yeah, and there's just a ton of layering going on too.
Yeah,
you've got like 3 different synth voices added to the body.
Exactly. He's not relying on reverb to create body for the music. And nor are these the kind of really florid melodies that are becoming popular in underground BM. They're kind of just sequences of chords. It's not like a 16-note riff. I think I'll give that one a pass. I also, I really liked the kind of off-time... He delivers similar phrases with different rhythmic structures in a pretty cool way. Towards the beginning, when it goes out of the straight blast, there's a kind of like... Does it like a 6-beat phrase? There's a phrase that's like a 6 and a 7, and then immediately goes back into 6 and maybe 7 again, and then it just flattens out into triplets. There's really pretty cool rhythmic variation happening under that's uncommon in black metal.
Yeah, and that's pretty consistent across...
But becoming more common.
Yeah, it is. And that's pretty consistent across the black metal material on this EP, is that, relatively simple melodic lines that get contorted with one really big elaborate chord phrasing and 2 these little rhythmic inflections that give them a little bit more dimension.
He's able to he's able to pivot rhythmically without breaking the continuum of the trem and blasting. Without breaking momentum. And I think that is really difficult and cool. And another band that did that well, really just in 1 or 2 points on the record, because it's deliberately much more simple music, but is Oppressive Descent, who I guess this guy did a split with.
Yeah,
But Oppressive Descent started off the last record. One thing I loved about it is it just went in from like a, big blast riff, and in the middle of it changed to triplets and changed the riff.
Yeah.
It's, like without breaking stride, right?
Which, if you think about it, is like a really traditional kind of Scandinavian technique. We forgot about it for a long time.
No, but he did it while blasting. It wasn't the shift to like, it wasn't the whap, dung, da da dung, dung, da da dung, dung, da da dung. It was like, straight 4/4 blasting immediately into triplet blasting. I mean, I guess, Scandinavian bands would do that for sure. Like, I guess if you're Sacramentum or something, right? You'd barrel through a 4/4 and then change to a triplet blast. But there'd be like a drum fill.
Yeah,
right?
There'd be something announcing it.
This was like continue, right? And maybe the riff would change in a dramatic way. This was just like continuous. But yeah, so this is that. I found that won me over, and in winning me over, it reminds me of a certain other well-executed sentimental black metal project that I believe you're about to mention.
Yeah. So. Okay, so this EP, it's like 3 original black metal songs that are all kind of in the similar vein to Pine. I just think Pine's the best executed. Then you've got the long, sprawling ambient track. And then we got to close out, apart from a little outro piece, with a cover, a black metal reinterpretation of Kektarok's one non-black metal song off the last record, which is Swordsman. Well, here you go, buddy. I've got the version of Swordsman you can tolerate. So.
All right, let's see. My least favorite Kektarok track.
All right.
Yeah.
So if you flatten Swordsman out into a black metal song, you realize, oh, it's like an Amasur song or something,
Still feels like getting my sword flattened. All right.
I just think it's fun to hear. It's like, okay, so you take the one non-black metal song off that, turn it back into a black metal song, and what's the effect of it? It's like it still ends up being like kind of a post-rock song ultimately.
Yeah, you can't defeat the you can't defeat those chord changes. Or rather, you can't make them good. I was kind of with it for the beginning of it, right? I was like, okay, it was cool hearing him he's kind of imitating Kektarok's guitar style there, sort of chiming it.
Mm-hmm.
That was cool, and it's like, okay, well, this is like this is an emo song, but like I'll buy it. And then it did something in the middle where it just went
when it hits the chorus,
it just went all super fruity again. And after that point, I was lost. But at least it doesn't have auto-tune.
Well, what I think is interesting, especially with that kind. Okay, so you turn this back into a black metal song, it becomes like a post-rock emo song. But more to the point, I'm interested in, I guess the question to toss up is, especially just since we've been doing the show, periodically covering sort of post-black metal bands. I'd say Luminous Veil is one of the ones furthest on the side of post-black that we've covered.
Sure.
But listening to the difference of post-black, of at least the bands we're covering, versus the kind of stuff that we were just infected with in like the early 2010s.
Mm-hmm.
Have we finally gotten to the point where kind of post-black technique has been flattened out and incorporated in, that we can use these things in more traditional black metal ways without it seeming completely disjointed?
I mean, I think we're certainly at the point where people are making things that are obviously post-black that don't suck, right? I mean,
it took a while, but we are.
So in that category, you could group this, in terms of things we've covered like that, you could group this with, you probably like this project a bit better than me. We could group that with Chilean, which I think I liked a bit better than you. But this is this reminds me a lot of Chilean as well, in terms of stuff that is very fully engaged the non-black metal side of things, while finding ways to incorporate black metal influence that are not so obvious.
Hey, it's Kari from Sepulchre Curse.
And I'm Jakob.
You're listening to Terminus.
All right, and we are back from debating the theological merits of the God of War games to review A Monument in Darkness by Concilivm on Iron Bonehead. So, on the Facebook page, there has been a long our About Us description for a long time has been something the death metal guy wrote, which is, say it.
Heated opinions on Chilean war metal.
And obviously we had to have this on the show because it is literally Chilean war metal. But, not really. And that brings us into it. I think the impression I got from the press release and from an initial listen was that these guys were kind of pulling on every strain of non-second wave type black metal and Black Death stuff from the early 90s. And that's kind of true, but on more listens, it really doesn't sound particularly retro. I think when you get sort of Latin American blasty Black Death, right, you're thinking Cogumelo or Goat Penis or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure Cogumelo's a reference point here, but it's not really at the center. The production is quite different. This isn't produced to bash you over the head or engulf you in noise. It's a kind of murky and heavily recessed production. Things are set back in various ways. And overall, this comes across as much more like the Hessian firm dark metal idea or the cryptic metal idea that Brandon Corsair has talked about. This kind of, this sort of the stuff that resists the Black Death divide and that has a kind of, maybe a kind of a death metal heft to it, and death metal technique, but the kind of elusive, the kind of strange, ineffable mystic atmospheres you get in black metal, right? And at a formally what that means, with a good example of the cryptic thing would be like really early Septic Flesh or the first few Rotting Christ records. Mm-hmm. And Rotting Christ is definitely a reference point on this. But a lot of that idea has to do with this kind of like percussive guitar technique, strange murky production, and big consonant heavy metal riffs used in a kind of spooky or droning way. And this record has all of those things. It also has a bunch of kind of more standard blasty Black Death stuff, or war metal-y parts. And I think we both agree those are actually not the center of gravity here and kind of the weak links.
Yeah. Analyzing this record is kind of a challenge, just because this is sort of a grab bag of different things. Not in the sense that it sounds, super eclectic or, they're randomly switching genres, but rather it's just there's such a multitude of death and black and even thrash influences these guys are pulling on that it becomes kind of difficult to tell what the center of it is. I think that you identify certain parts in your own way. The thing that kept hitting me on this was certain parts of like mid to late 90s death metal, specifically like Euro death metal, and really zeroing in on some of the mid-era Dismember records, especially like death metal or to a lesser extent Massive Killing Capacity, where death metal bands were seeing the upswing in kind of Gothenburg-style melodeath and started folding in some of those ideas without committing to the conceit of, doing the melodic thing all the time, but incorporating some of those, headier, more directly Iron Maiden-inspired melodeath riffs. And you'll hear a lot of that across this record. You've definitely got these blasty kind of war metal parts, but in a sense they feel almost perfunctory to me at certain points of this record. It feels like the where the heart of this band lies is in the admittedly like really well developed, really interesting kind of lead guitar driven stuff. The most melodic moments on this record seem to be what these songs are really anchored in. And I think, for the most part, they stick the landing on those really elaborate melodic parts. However, I also get the sense that, like, structurally, some of these songs are such a straight line to those big melodic parts. It sort of flattens everything out, and maybe it doesn't give the heft to those grittier, more war metal parts that maybe they need.
Yeah. So, some of that Black Death riffing is well executed, but it definitely seems, it's definitely playing second fiddle to other stuff. And I think one question would be, could it be made to work? Where does it work better? And could it be made to work better as part of the formula? So I think, since I saw your notes, I've thought, like, okay, can I hear the Dismember here? And I think I can. I don't know those later Dismember records, right? But I can definitely find parts that sound like an ever-flowing stream. I think something that struck me that I told you was, in addition to this kind of highly, consonant melodic cryptic stuff, there's much more straight-up death metal than you would expect on something that's like that you might have thought or assumed was a black, a war metal or a Black Death record. There are just riffs on here that sound kind of like incantation.
Yeah.
Whatever, right? Or maybe like blasted versions of the more abrasive Sweet Death riffing.
Or just, the most death metal parts of Slayer. I think there's a lot of thrash tucked away on this as well.
Oh, no, thrash is huge here, and thrash is important for the cryptic metal sound. So let's get to that. The thing that I think is the sort of elephant in the room here is that I've been waiting for it forever, but I think this is the first band I've ever heard that has where it's like, I don't know if it was supposed to be the main reference point for the band, but certainly, like, its centers of gravity on this record all orbit around Armored Angel. And it is the first band I've heard that, like, really seems to be deliberately playing Armored Angel riffs. Armored Angel being Australia's answer to this kind of mystical Hellenic sound, right? They started as a speed metal band. They started as a kind of like extreme speed metal band and kind of kept a lot of those big heavy metal, glorious heavy metal melodies, but then just got more and more like into The Killing Joke and Bolt Thrower. So you get just this like massive rolling mid-tempo grooves with strangely lush melodic playing over it, but all very minimal. And so there's absolutely zero black metal parts, but the mood is very black metal. This band, the best parts on this record are like that. So we both picked sampled stuff from Moonlight Negrita, which is towards the end of the record, and I think that will give a good sense of the, sort of the range, basic range of sounds here, but especially these sort of the big riffs that are sort of maybe stealing the show here. Okay, so the first couple riffs on that sample, you can definitely hear being kind of dismembery. Especially that kind of winding, chromatic arpeggio stuff at the very beginning. And even when it starts that sort of more dissonant double bass part, it's kind of, you could hear it being dismembery. Mm-hmm. Then, right, we get the dropout and the suspense for the entry of the big riff, right? Which is this kind of, it's just a straight rolling chug riff, double bass chug riff with a sick kind of glistening arpeggio turnaround at the end. There's like a big octave leap. I can't even hum it. Right?
Yeah.
Right? And it's kind of patterned. Structurally, it's more like a thrash riff than anything. Right? In the same way that you've pointed out, Bolt Thrower really just sounds much more like Slayer than any other, quote, death metal band.
Yeah.
Right? So keep that riff in your head, and let's do a side-by-side comparison with the what's probably like Armored Angel's calling card song, Enigmatize, which I've actually played on an interlude to this show like a year ago or more. But we're going to sample a bit over the first minute of this track, first minute and 15. This is from the Mysterium EP in 1994. unfortunately, you have to stop driving your tank-like vehicle really slow because now we have to talk about the sample.
Yeah, it's the same picture.
Yeah, you heard it, right?
Yeah.
Especially... What?
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's because, at the root of both of those bands is really both thrash and bolt thrower. And I'm glad that you brought up bolt thrower because I think that's a pretty central thing to Concilivm also.
Yeah. I mean, I think this track is basically, that's basically a quote of the Enigmatize riff. Not note for note at all, right? But
they do their own turnaround, but the whole conceit of it's the same.
Yes, the match was especially close to that last riff, the sort of release riff after the chorus. Dun 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 dun. Right? Yeah, so Concilivm write a version of that kind of turnaround riff that's the center of the show. The bolt thrower thing is huge. So I've always been an Armored Angel booster. I mention them whenever I can on the show. It's awesome to hear a band engaging with it directly and doing it in a way that's more than just a kind of a cheap worship project, right? Or an attempt to pull one over people by cloning an old band and presenting it as original, right? That's not what's going on here, right? There's a lot of other stuff in this band's sound. They've modernized the production a lot, and the Armored Angel are subtle musicians, but it's deliberately primitive and reductive music. Mm-hmm. This, Concilivm is a lot more... Concilivm are willing to put a lot more notes in riffs and things like that. It's, they're doing their own thing, and the idea of, okay, Armored Angel, as part of this Australian trajectory of sort of thrash-based extreme music, right, is part of the Aussie war metal history, right? It's not a war metal band, but it's very close to them, and they were playing the kind of music that evolved into Bestial Warlust or whatever, back in the sort of speed metal shit they were doing in the 80s becomes D666.
Yeah.
So, okay, what if we take that and we install that in a broader Black Death canvas, right? Or, with the full Black Death palette and, more actual death metal and shit. That's a good idea. But, yeah, I think, this band is still figuring out how to do that. You've got something for the end of this song.
Yeah, I wanted to get to the end of Moonlight Negredo. So... here's a good example of the lead-driven melodic. So you're going to hear some of the same stuff that we heard in your sample, because this is kind of one of those songs that sort of plays itself twice. Mm-hmm. It starts at the end, works through some middle bridging passages, and then it reverses itself on the way out. Mm-hmm. But here, I think it's a good example of them doing the installation of the more melodic stuff better than on some of the other songs. On some of the other songs, the transition from the more chromatic stuff to the, melodic lead-driven work can be kind of abrupt, and not just in, a cool neck-snapping turnaround way, but a kind of it's just, okay, we're just starting this now. Here, the run-up's a little bit more granular. So let's kind of get to the back minute and a half of this song and listen to the way that it unfolds. So I assume you can already guess the album I'm going to be comparing all that to. One of my standard go-tos.
for Dismember?
No, for just that kind of riffing. You know, rolling double kick, kind of like simple but dramatic, piercing lead guitar work within a kind of a Swedish death metal context.
Wait, I think I glimpsed it on the notes. But, yeah, early Amon Amarth, right?
Yeah, it's 1 cent. Yeah, that's definitely, that's very 1 cent. There seems to be, at least...
Oh, the riff at the end with that kind of soaring... Yeah, I hear that. I hear that for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's kind of a thread of Swedish death metal, but not the classic Swedeth records.
Yeah. Swedish death metal, but not that Swedeth.
Right? Yeah, it's like it's like it's not Grave, it's not Unleashed, it's not Entombed.
To be fair, Grave and Unleashed are not the central. It's really Entombed and the early Dismember that are the or like Carnage that are the normative Swedeths.
Yeah.
And, like Unleashed and Grave are like Mongoloids doing their own thing in the corner.
I would say Entombed are Mongoloids too.
In a different sense. I mean, with Unleashed and Grave, I mean it in a complementary sense.
Yeah. But so let's think about stuff that's like a little bit more marginal. Let's think about, okay, so what about after the first couple Dismember records, the ones that a lot of people listen to, but not everybody, not like the first two. Let's talk about, the first Amon Amarth record, which is a death metal record, kind of fundamentally. But it's also one that's really influenced by Bolt Thrower, as we've talked about on the show previously. Bolt Thrower itself is a big influence on this record, but multiple eras of it. There's some stuff that's very early kind of Realms of Chaos, and then you have some of their more refined later stuff. So it seems that there is a circuit of contiguous musical ideas in this band. It's just executed in a fashion you might not think of the first time through. So here I really like the way they, I think that sample that I chose here is a really good chunk of the kind of arc I want to hear from this band a little bit more. Because actually, I think those, early on in my sample, those kind of grittier, more war metal style riffs are really good. There's some of the finer examples of that on the record. And the way it's able to, they slowly morph, they become more melodic, and then when the big lead moment, concludes, at the end of the song, where you've got that big Amon Amarth riff, it feels really earned. It doesn't feel like an arbitrary decision. I think, honestly, that structurally, this song, I think, is toward the top of the pile for the record. And also, just like as a side note, the track listing of this record is very strange.
Yeah.
Because like the first...
Wait, let me talk about the structure real quick.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I think this is it's got to be the highlight track. It's one of the two highlight tracks on the record. And, a thing that I could have said after my sample, but that goes with what you're just saying, is like, one thing that sets them apart from an Armored Angel worship band is that at the end of, they rock that big Enigmatize riff out for quite a long time. And then at the end of it, right where I fade out, right? Yeah. They start sort of modifying it in ways that transition seamlessly into the blasting death metal riffs. And there's like 40 seconds of that development that we cut out. And when Death Metal Guy's sample drops in, there's been a seamless development to it. And in the death metal riffing there, you can still hear you can hear that the death metal riff, the blasted death metal riff, which can sound kind of like incantation, turns around like the Armored Angel riff.
Yeah.
It's just tremoloed, but it has that kind of flourishing octave leap, glistening turnaround bit hidden in it at the end. And that's like, so you hear all the stylistic influences really fused there. So yeah, and at the end of the track, right, as they return to the basic idea of the big riff, but none of those riffs in your sample actually repeat it. There are various different, like, different sort of phrases that are embellishing on and building on the big riff. So when they're at their best, they do a really good job of creating a kind of continuity. Now let's talk about the track listing.
Yeah. So there is almost a remarkable structural unevenness between songs on this record. Like Moonlight Negredo is one of the most sophisticated, and I think it's probably you're probably right. It probably is the best song on the album. Really smart, organic riff development, just structurally very clean, very professional. There's other songs, like I think we both agreed that Oniric Abyss, the second track, is just it's kind of a bummer. Like it's just nothing really happens on that song, you know?
No, so I like the first track, you don't. But
I like the track, I just don't think it lines up with the expectations of the rest of the record.
And when I think about it, the album starts on a very strong note. There's a pretty cool kind of spooky... There's like a spooky voice trick of the kind that you'd get in a nu metal record, but it's like really cool. It's like really cool, and it produces exactly the kind of like rhythmic drop heaviness that is best in those moments. And then there's a really fast kind of like really whiplash turnaround into like downbeat thrash riffing, which I'm always a sucker for. But like it has this kind of rolling fluidity that I think introduces the flowing double bass vibe that has the dominant thing on the record.
Yeah.
Or that's like in the highlights. But I can't remember the second half of that track. And then after that, Oniric Abyss, it's just, I don't know, some blasty chords. The Veil descends, I don't remember at all. And then for me, the album really starts again at Of Gold and Silver, which is, I think, the same for you.
Exactly. Yeah, it's interesting that we both thought that way. I paid attention on The Veil Descends because that's when the really melodic stuff starts. But it's not especially well executed on that track. It starts getting elaborated on and executed a lot better with Of Gold and Silver. So it's a very, very strange. I wonder if this is a record where it's like, you've got some songs that are like maybe some sort of like leftover ideas from unfinished previous stuff kind of worked into a song, and then maybe all the strongest stuff is when these guys really started working together. I don't know. There's a bunch of possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, the cliche is this would be much stronger as a really crushing EP. But even if you cut off the 2 week, even if you dropped Oniric and The Veil Descends, it's still clocking at 29 minutes, which these days, if you wanted to, you could just say is a full length. Yeah,
that'd be fine.
Yeah.
And I think it would be...
also, if you throw in some ambient bullshit,
Yeah, there you go. You get another 8 minutes out of that, no problem.
They probably do some pretty good ambient bullshit, though.
Yeah, probably. But so let's listen to Of Gold and Silver. So this is going to be kind of like getting back to the same things I've already been talking about. You're going to hear the Once Sent stuff. You're going to hear the Bolt Thrower again. And here you're going to hear pretty distinctly, at least to my ear, the Dismember circa death metal stuff, which is a record that you would probably really like. You should check that out.
You should play that on the interlude because you keep mentioning it.
Yeah, because that's like a Dismember record that basically nobody listens to, even though it's probably one of my favorites.
I think Sepulchral Curse likes that era of Dismember, but they're the only band I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's weird stuff. Imagine Once Sent, but like a little bit more death metal and played like a Chainsaw HM2 band.
That sounds good.
Yeah, it's really cool. So let's listen to the first couple minutes of Gold and Silver, and here you're going to hear the chromatic stuff and the melodic stuff blend together really well in a way that I think this band should stick with and elaborate on in the future. Yeah, so I really like the way they're they're abutting these kind of more negged out, weird sounding incantation riffs against more melodic stuff, but the difference isn't so stark that it feels unnatural. And I do like the idea of a death metal band exploring both sides of this kind of melodic divide and making songs that are all about kind of, studying these subtle contrasts between the two. And I think that tends to work better on this record than the most punch-you-in-the-face snap moments where they're suddenly launching into really melodic stuff.
Well, and that fits with the idea of this sort of like dark metal or cryptic metal, which is not supposed to work in a, even the really melodic stuff is supposed to have something sinister or misty or, sort of archaic about it, right? It's not supposed to, an early Rotting Christ riff is not supposed to hit like a heavy metal riff. It's sort of it hypnotically iterates and kind of it's shaped differently, it's rhythmically delivered differently. And it's delivered often in constant blasted palm muted chug, right? So there's all of this stuff happening that's sort of darkening and all sorts of stuff happening to like, unlike the Norse bands, right? You're not sort of like harmonizing the glorious stuff or like unlike a Swedish band like Dawn, right, where you have these kind of glorious melodies that are harmonized in this very tense, furious way, right, or like Gorgoroth or whatever, right? It's you just deliver the big fucking glorious melody, but like it's everything about how it's voiced and delivered makes it a lot more sinister and a lot more obscure. Right?
Yeah.
And so the riff at the beginning of All of Golden Soul does that really well. And is a lot like a Rotting Christ riff. And it just kind of, the rhythm there is very very much in that vein too. It's just kind of this like head nod.
Yeah, well, I think something these guys appreciate in a pretty subtle way is that I think a lot of people tend to forget that old death metal, like 80s and 90s death metal, is musically kind of flat in a way. It's very horizontal. There are bands with songs that have big moments on them, but in a sense that was kind of the exception rather than the rule. I mean, if you listen to... okay, so yeah, you're going to listen to your big guys, you're going to listen to your Morbid Angel and your fucking Suffocation, and they're going to have big moments. But if you're listening to, let's say, like an Autopsy record, or you're listening to, get even more obscure, you go to like Morpheus Descends or Resurrection, these sort of like second tier bands, you'll listen to entire records where nothing huge happens. It was designed for you to dig that out of it. And the appreciation and recognizing the subtlety of when something big does happen that's not marked for you was kind of part of the game. And I like that quality on this record, where they're not marking off the big moment, It is a more kind of flat, horizontal, organic experience. It's up for you to listen closely and decide when the important thing happens. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I mean, what would be an example of a song where they do that? Like, in Moonlit Negretto, they obviously mark off the big moment, but in a way that I think they're allowed to, because it sounds so sick.
Well, yeah, that's of course sort of the climax of the record. I think that happens on The Veil Descends. They mark that melodic part really clearly. I believe it also happens on the title track, A Monument in Darkness.
Monument in Darkness is less successful. Yeah, that comes in with a big melodic trem riff that honestly sounds a little bit like some of the Malignant Voices bands.
I think that these guys are maybe at their best when it's like, I don't want to say restrained, but just like a little bit more, I don't know, just straightforward. Yeah.
Well, let's get to that. I mean, so on the one hand, maybe, so they're like, they're dealing with a spectrum of sound, and maybe we're saying they need to bring it more to the center of that spectrum. On the one hand, you've got stuff that's kind of like rote grinding. It's often better than many other bands do with that kind of blasting war metal stuff. Like, if they have a churning 4-chord riff, the chords are maybe voiced in cool ways. Maybe there's a lot of propulsion in the drumming, you know? It's certainly a decent version of it, but it's just not the highlight of the record. And ironically, those really aggressive parts are the parts where the band is hiding the most. Yeah. It's kind of, those are the most recessed and obscure parts in a bad way. Obscure in a bad way. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, maybe you have some moments that make too many concessions to modern sort of pop metal conventions, right? Where you're going to be like, mark the big hook riff, here comes the big melodic trim riff, or whatever, right? I think, like, Maleficent Creation is a good track. That's the closest they have to a really well-executed, straight-up war metal song. I think that one's quite good. But yeah, in terms of things that bring all these sides together, certainly Moonlight Negredo and I would say the last track. So let's get to my last sample. It's to build off what you said about the sort of the development and the continuum and not off. One thing that happens is that when they play one of, another way of putting it would be there's a kind of big riff that these guys should do. And the kind of big riff they should do are the giant chug riffs. Mm-hmm. And when they do it, when they have a song where they play the giant chug riffs, everything that follows them is stronger because they're speaking to those riffs. So there's an interesting thing that happens where every time they do one of those massive riffs, the incantation, the blasty stuff that follows it, the riffs are like better. Not just do they hit, it's not just they hit harder from the contrast. The riffs that followed are like better and ironically more dissonant and nasty than in other tracks. So let's try Archetype. And other thing I'll say before this is that every time I get, this is the last track, every time I get to it, I turn it up.
Yeah, that's really good. All right, we are back from discussing the relationship between different species of butterfly and the Sigma male grind set to bring you an independent release. This is an interesting one. This is a fan submission. It's weird to say it like that. Anyway, this is a band that is called Evocator. Sort of based out of Sweden, but with members in various places, including our one and only Nick from Hessian Firm, the famed dark metal label, on vocals for this band. This is Evocator's first full-length record, called Ancient Cataclysm. Very sick album art for this one. And as I said, this is a straight-up independent release. So... Evocator put out an EP last year that I heard called Chronicles of Pestilence. I think that was Nick's first work with the band, and relatively quickly after, given kind of the scope of this record, we have the debut full-length. So Evocator is branded as, in essence, a doom death band, but that's not nearly covering the scope of everything that's going on. Obviously, there is a core of sort of melodic or Peaceville influenced doom death, but there's also a lot of just atmospheric black metal, little touches of prog sparingly dotted around. And the overall sense that I get from this is like, it's almost weird to say, but it's like, how fast can a funeral doom record be? Because there's something about this record that... It feels like a funeral doom album. Even though there's blast beats and the tempos are much higher than most funeral doom, there's something about the scope and the weight of this music that suggests that to me. But what does that mean materially for the music? Well, this is a 4-track album that's, clocking in probably around 45 minutes. And each of these songs is conceptual in nature and pretty vast in scope. This is not riff-based music. This is not very heavy metal in the traditional sense. But there is a lot that goes on in all of these songs, despite the low tempos and despite the relative simplicity of a lot of it. This is a record that's more interested in constructing itself in almost a kind of neoclassical way. These are songs with very distinct movements. You don't get the sense that this was plotted out from one riff to the next to the end of the song, but kind of built up in a more vertical, granular fashion with all the elements working in concert with each other. It's interesting. This is a hard record to talk about before you've played samples, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, should we just get to it?
Well, let's take a moment. Well, let me get your initial impressions, because there's going to be a lot to unravel on this. I think there's some questions I want to ask about this music.
Yeah.
I mean, straight up, I like this a lot. I think this is really interesting, and I'm really excited to see what happens after this.
Yeah, I think there's a strong core of originality to this. I think this band has the idea thing in spades, right? In terms of the concept, okay, let's do sort of death doom that moves at a somewhat faster tempo and that uses primarily black metal guitar technique, rhythm guitar technique, and goes for this kind of continuous streaming chords in a black metal way with this kind of faster tempos. That's an interesting idea. Just the idea of, I kind of agree that the niche this falls into is probably funeral doom. That's an example of it being fast. I suppose another band we've talked about who, another band doing fast doom would be Rotting Kingdom, right? Mm-hmm. But Rotting Kingdom is much more of a down-the-line death doom band, and they have a very different notion of what it means to push that music in the push the tempo there, right? They're playing like they're playing upper mid tempo, they're playing Death Doom at upper mid tempo, which sounds fast. Evocator are playing like Funeral Doom at lower mid tempo, which still sounds fast for that, right? There's much more black metal here. It's an interesting idea, having these sprawling songs with these slowly accreting waves of guitar, theatrical transitions, foregrounded vocals. This band has some idea of the kind of thing they're going for. But I'm going to say, kind of like the Concilivm, I think this band hasn't quite found its center. I think my attitude toward this record is cordially critical. That is, I basically I like a lot of. I think I would, if you had to say, do you like or dislike this band? I'd say I like this band, but I'd also add they're not that good yet. Does that make sense?
Kinda. Well, we were talking about this.
I'd like to. Yeah. So say what you're going to say.
Well, we were talking about this before we started recording, where I was like, I think that I like this more just because I've got more time for, and I think I'm probably more acquainted with some of the sort of atmospheric doom stuff these guys are pulling from. I listened to a lot of stuff that was kind of like this, in the late 2000s. This resembles... It's hard to pick about because there's a ton of influences here, but going to the Funeral Doom stuff, I'm hearing, some Elysian Blaze. I'm hearing maybe some Colosseum, which would be a really weird pull. And I'm hearing a lot of stuff that was on a label called Firedoom Music back in the day. And a lot of that had this sort of misty, atmospheric, synth and vocal-led Funeral Doom thing going on. And I think I've got a soft spot for that style, So and that's something that's been out of fashion for a lot of years now. So it's interesting to hear this again. So I get what you're saying. I have some critical notes, but I think just the bulk of this style is something I've got more patience for it in general.
Yeah, well, I would certainly like to hear them develop this. I think, I could do... Maybe I'll save some of my more specific critical notes for when we get into the samples. My overall thing might be... It's kind of Death Doom, but the predominant flavor in many ways is black metal. And there's some question... There is... No decision has yet been made about which is the form to rule them all. What style is creating the structural parameters for the music, right? It's not
I get you. Yeah.
It's not guys, you need to choose a genre, right? It's not the point. Of course, it's an interesting idea to try to blend all these things, and I can see the common threads they're getting at, right? But yeah, you see what I mean, right? It's a little bit anarchic, right? There's got to be some... They have to figure out a hierarchy and a definite structure for what is the black metal stuff the most important stuff? Is the idea of this as a doom band doing black metal-y things the most important thing? What is setting the what is providing the forms and what's providing the content, right? Are we dealing with... You get that?
I get what you're saying. I think...
Doom structures and pacing and black metal riffs, or do we want the music to really work more like very slow black metal? Those are two kind of different things.
I think I get what you're saying.
And what's the role for death metal in all of this? Because there's very little here that you could isolate as a death metal part.
Yeah. Well, that part of it, Death Doom is sort of a term of art.
No, I know. It's just heavy, aggressive.
It doesn't really refer to... It mostly doesn't refer to death metal at all anymore. But I would say I get where you're coming from in terms of, what's kind of the structural conceit behind this. I think, though, my read is that this feels like a band that makes these sort of structural decisions from song to song. Because I think that there's... Both of our samples on both sides of the table here are from the same song. So clearly, it's like we agree those are the best ones. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if it's a matter of picking a structural conceit so much as there's just different levels of execution, obviously. Because I'll go out on a limb and say, I bet your least favorite song is the same as me, which is Ode to Osiris, the third one.
Yeah, kind of. That one's kind of a snoozer.
Yeah.
Ruination of Alashia has
I like
the first track. Yeah. It's got one really dramatic moment, and some of the... I kind of get what it's doing. I when I listened to that one, I was like, okay, I get what this is doing. I find it a little slow, also, not in the literal sense, but, a slow listen.
Yeah.
But it's doing an interesting thing. Then we get into Tremors of Poseidon, and I'm like, oh, shit, this is sick.
Yeah.
So let's listen to that one, huh?
Yeah, let's listen to Tremors of Poseidon, because holy fuck. And so now we can start breaking down the constituent elements. And then... Because I think when we break it down more, maybe we'll be able to kind of unravel how this stuff is constructed a little bit better. So, Tremors of Poseidon, I've got the opening of this track. It's like, you're like, this is the best moment. I was going to pick this one.
It's true.
Well, you write your notes earlier, and you'll be able to pick the fun ones, Black Metal Guy. All right, so Tremors of Poseidon, let's go to the beginning of this track, and this is probably the single finest moment on the record. So yeah, we gotta talk about the fucking vocal performance on this record.
Yeah, so this one's weird, right? Because the vocalist is like a good friend of ours, and actually currently a patron of Terminus. although for the most part of the last few years has not been. But he's he's been on our Discord since the beginning, right? This is like our buddy. So there's some bias here. However, I think we were both expecting to just hear him, I don't know, doing some cool vocals, right? Yeah. He's a death metal guy, and he also, I know, listens to, classic heavy metal and has respect for those vocalists. So maybe I expected some death metal vocals and some, maybe some more heavy metal stuff. Mm-hmm. Not just like a full spectrum performance that sounds like Greek tragedy.
It's so fucking good. We've heard some of his work before and it was solid, but I think maybe it's just because it's a band like this where he gets to do everything that you really get to hear the range. And just that whole sequence, the way he responds to just the maneuvers of the guitars and the music as a whole in kind of unexpected ways sometimes, going harsher over the clean guitar passage, stuff like that.
Oh, that part is crushing.
It's crushing.
I also am surprised by the tone of his death metal vocals. He sounds like, I don't know what I had expected, but it sounds more like, his death metal tone sounds like the kind of death metal vocals I like kind of crusty, deep guttural puke kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like the bolt thrower thing, or the they're like very raw, ragged death metal vox.
Mm-hmm. And I've heard other stuff he's done where he's able to do more traditional kind of growly stuff. So everything's been very carefully considered here. And I've talked to. Well, I think the big influence here is I've talked to Nick a lot about this, and he and I both basically agree Attila from Mayhem is like the apex metal vocalist, and you can hear that so clearly here, the influence.
The declamation I can't make out all the lyrics, but the declamation during that part is so cool. When he's just sort of like speaking in this kind of like pitched up kind of heroic oratory, right?
It's like a better realization of what Maniac was doing on Grand Declaration.
Yeah, for sure. It like when you hear that, it feels like a character from Herodotus is speaking or something. Herodotus being like a historian and an early historian, but he writes in this kind of epic mythopoeic mode. Or like one of the, he might be speaking as Poseidon there, right? It could sound like one of, like one of Aeschylus's gods speaking or something. Not that the poetry's on the same level, not that the lyrics are on the same level poetically, but it completely captures the mood. Mm-hmm. I'd like to read the lyrics more. Do you know if he did the lyrics?
I'm not sure. I haven't talked to him about it. I'll have to ask him after we record.
It's it's simultaneously evoking the actual ancient early classical reference points, and also just like fucking Leonidas in the 300 movie, right?
And this is such a great section because it packs in like all the different styles, into a kind of a compact territory. But the thing is, something I feel like we notice across the record is that like when Nick is on, it tends to be in the points where the band is most on. Because musically, this is a fucking outstanding passage, too.
Yes.
You've got that big crushing doom riff to open things. It slips into that kind of pantheist-style clean guitar passage there. And what I really like, and what's really present across the record, but very distinctly here, is the sort of iterative quality of some of the melodic work in the guitars here. There's not a ton of distinct riffs per song on this record, but they'll tend to take one, deconstruct it, manipulate it, and kind of explore all corners of its territory for a couple minutes at a time. And there's definitely places where that works better than others, but here that really lands. I mean, what you're hearing here is basically all iterations on the same general melodic idea, but it explores this sort of theatrical territory in a super effective way. It's like when this album fires on all cylinders, it's as good as anything, you know.
That's firing on cylinders I didn't know existed. You know, like that part is, and you know what we were saying about the vocals. It's like, you know, one of the problems with that album is the vocals are too good. Like, he sounds like, I was saying during the sample, like, we are not just saying this because he's our friend, right? We have to bracket it, right? You show your respect for your friends by giving them shit,
disavowing your relationship with them.
and by giving them serious constructive criticism, right? But like, you know, not giving unwarranted praise. He sounds like he's in a tier 1 band.
Yeah.
Right? Like he's in a canonical band, right? It's pretty crazy. So this band, you know, the band almost faces a challenge of, how do you bump the vocal? I'm not sure the band realizes that the vocals are the forefront of this music. So how do you compose it in a way to consciously boost the vocals to the front?
Well,
you know what I mean? These songs aren't written to foreground vocals.
I kind of like
the next album. The next album, well,
I kind of like. I think in a situation like this, especially with how theatrical the style is, it would be easy to push that way out in front. But the way the vocals kind of sit in the mix, just you know, maybe a hair quieter than you might think is appropriate, I actually kind of like. I think it contributes to the whole maintaining these very kind of distinct, individualized atmospheres between the songs.
No, that's a fair point, but I guess maybe what I'm getting at more is like the question about the undecided questions of format.
What's the leading voice?
What's the leading voice, and like, do we? Yeah, I don't know. But that passage is phenomenal. And you know, the part you're comparing to Pantheist, I think you mean the do 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 do.
Yeah, that little clean guitar break. Yeah.
I don't hear that as clean guitar. That's like super distorted, isn't it?
Comparatively to the big kind of funeral doom chorus.
I get what you mean. Okay, the part that's
the
not,
lead break,
the part that's not metal.
Yeah,
right? The part that's not like crushing fuzz, right?
Yeah.
So what that part sounds like a lot to me is like breaks in Sonic Youth tracks.
I was getting a little bit of that too.
And harmonic, this sort of harmonic tapping on Sister or Daydream Nation or something.
Yeah, I was hearing something like that. I didn't think to pin it on Sonic Youth in particular, but some sort of, oddball post-punk edge or something. It's interesting. It's
Sonic Youth and just goth.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and the goth stuff is obvious. Sonic Youth is a hair's breadth away from goth, really. They're just one of these American bands listening to British goth bands and, producing a version of it that will play better in art galleries. But, I mean, that's not to knock their own innovations, right? Good band. But, it fits naturally, right? Because the goth was always a big presence in the Peaceville bands.
Yeah.
Right? And the interesting thing, right, is between the strong bass playing during that passage and Nick's vocals, right? When he hits that, he brings out like just the really guttural stuff there. That passage hits really hard. And in terms of the textural guitar work, I think that is much stronger than most of the guitars on this record. So I want to that's my main criticism here. And we'll get that to my next sample. Although, the format here seems to be doom, with sort of a funeral doom atmospheric tone, the guitar, there seems to be a conscious choice to let's make the guitar very black metal, And we want to try to, like, to do that, you want, like, this continuous streaming guitar sound, but it has to be kind of slow. And the guitarist has an interesting creative approach for this. All these songs have kind of a triple feel, and he's doing these kind of staggered, churning syncopations over it. Right? That's a cool idea, and it's really good for building tension. But the problem is the riffs themselves are super bare bones. Basically, for the most part, they're these kind of like just orthodox black metal chords. It sort of creates this thing where the record is this homogeneous, continuous sort of triplet trudge. But it's not getting the sort of, it doesn't get the drive that homogeneity creates in black metal. Right? You could compare it to something that might even be a reference point for these guys is Memory and Destiny by Graveland, which is almost a Doom record. That is like triplets for the most part. And it's these very slow, churning triplet black metal riffs, but it's got a lot of drive. It's not as committed to being doomy in tempo. This record is constantly sort of holding itself back and turning in on itself.
Okay.
Yeah, and so it creates, and what that does also is it means so it doesn't really work as driving slow black metal, and it also doesn't really work as doom because rhythm is really important in doom, right? Rhythmic, like, variation, the ability to do these big dropout moments with architectural long riffs, right? Or the ability to have huge, heavy death doom drops where, you roll into a chug or you syncopate or whatever, right? This band doesn't avail themselves of that rhythmic range very much at all because they're kind of invested in these black metal rhythmic ideas that aren't really black metaling. So, let's listen to... I want to take the sample from the end of Tremors of Poseidon. At the beginning, you'll hear kind of an example. I'm not going to linger on the parts that I think are not as good on this record. There's no point to. Just with the riffs at the beginning of this, you'll hear this kind of listless, orthodox stuff that just kind of slews back and forth. There's a lot of that throughout the record. You'll hear that, but then you'll hear them make rare use of a very successful Death Doom strategy. So yeah, at the end, right? They're sort of back to those, back to that kind of orthodox half step kind of chord progression. but it's much heavier. In part because of the vocals, in part because the guitarist is doing kind of cool chiming stuff again. But the highlight there is just when they play 4/4. Like, it's a strategy that it's like they're kind of like deliberate. This, I would almost say, like, the band, right, aside from the vocalist, as composers, this is a very thoughtful and deliberate record, and the concept is so thoroughly thought out that it's just very difficult to execute. And some of the thought is getting in the way of the execution. So they seem to have refused to use some of the obvious tools, like the 4/4 bulldozer beat, right? The thing that, like, all of Rotting Kingdom's music is, that do do da do do da do 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 da do do da do, right? And you know, when they do that, well, then they get this kind of they just get this cool kind of sawing downbeat chords, and it locks into a heavier groove. And then when the sort of more sinister chords come back at the end, they come in heavier. I would love to just hear more basic stuff, like death doomy stuff like that. Right?
It's interesting because this is such a Rorschach test kind of situation, because the stuff that scans to you as orthodox scans to me as, like, very contiguous within this, like, specific field of doom that I think is an influence here. And both can be correct. But it's like a lot of that sort of kind of droning half-step stuff was... I mean, that was very standard to a lot of these, like, mid to late 2000s doom bands, especially from, like, Sweden and Finland. Like, I mentioned Colosseum, Doom Us did some of that, Pantheist did some of that, Mythological Cold Towers. There's this whole scene that wasn't really a scene. It's only in retrospect that you realize a lot of these guys were playing around with similar ideas. And it's hard to tell just listening to this where some of those things are coming from. There's a lot of parallel evolution going on, especially in the 2000s, as we've talked about on the show plenty. But it's really interesting how this record as a whole scans, because I see this as so completely contiguous within this, like, doom history that I have, and you see it completely contiguous within a black metal history that you have.
Well, I mean, you're probably right about the doom stuff. It's just like, I guess here's the question. You're probably right, it's part of this doom tradition I don't know. And then I've just got to say, like, well, why are all these doom bands playing, like, underdeveloped, troped black metal riffs?
Because I think this is a case where a lot of stuff in this style was... Not to get on too big of a tangent, but I think a lot of this original era of this kind of thing was the product of a lot of doom bands trying to step outside, trying to be like, okay, so how do we develop songs that are not, in a sense, heavy metal songs? How do we make them more like, you know, the classical or ambient music we aspire to be? And a lot of that came with sort of de-emphasizing riffs. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but I think the sort of gestural quality you're hearing on a lot of this stuff is a deliberate choice. I don't think it's for lack of more precise ideas. I think it's deliberately pared down.
Okay, no, I get that. So let me be very clear. I'm not saying these guys can't write a riff. I mean, there are parts of the record that clearly prove otherwise, right? To me, especially when they're doing the more gothy stuff. Yeah. That's kind of what I mean by too thoughtful for its own good. This seems like some very conscious minimalism, right?
Yeah,
and I'm just
that's
like,
possible. Yeah.
And I'm just like, why this minimalism?
That's fair. Yeah. I think I get it as a product of, you know, building songs sort of exclusively off of the whole idea of movements, but your take is fair too. So.
Yeah. So I mean, point being. But, you know, if it were me, like, if I had to give some completely unsolicited advice, it'd be like, you'll get the black metal-y feel, or, as it were, maybe the atmospheric doom feel, without any of these sort of chorded half-step riffs. You can do it without any of that, just by having this kind of rumbling bass, maybe even more death metal rhythm section stuff, more chug, always more chug, and just let the lead guitar part do the gothy arpeggio stuff. You're really, really good at that. And if you combine that with this kind of just tectonic heavy low end, and you leave some more room for rhythmic space in it and change-ups in it, it will be much heavier, and it will also sound more like black metal.
Well, you know what? That leads me into a great segue, black metal guy. So, what about this as an idea? What if it's not about making it riffier? What if it's just about creating more precise, defined ideas with the material they already have? So let's go to Bane of Hattusa, which has, I think, just from a guitar perspective, one of the most interesting riffs on the record. So what you're going to hear is a very dissonant, ugly chord voicing being moved around the fretboard to etch out a very consonant sort of chord progression. Very French kind of technique, very sort of extreme doom technique. But I really love this part. So I'm wondering if maybe if this example would fit more with what you're looking for in terms of, let's increase the specificity, let's get more out of what's already there.
Yeah, that's powerful.
Yeah, I really, really like that part. That is a sort of guitar technique that I'm just a big sucker for. Just that the immediate contrast between this very simple, very consonant chord progression and this really discordant chord voicing, which is all kind of covering up the fact that the real riff is on the bass there the whole time. The bass is going all over the fucking place, doing this really kind of winding, elaborate melody as we're kind of drunkenly swaying with these really ugly chords. It's a very very French black metal kind of thing.
Yeah, well, there's a case. That actually is a fully worked out black metal riff. It's just slowed down, right?
Yeah.
It's not a particularly it's not a fancy French black metal riff, but why would it need to be, right?
Yeah.
It's a sort of fully fleshed out French style, chord progression riff, right? That's one way of thinking of doing this style, is like, okay, actual black metal riffs played in slow motion, right? Another idea I had different from the other one was like, why don't they just play Satanic Warmaster riffs but really slow, right? And
that's your answer to everything.
No, I'm often telling people to stop playing the Satanic Warmaster riffs. But the point being, like, this is kind of close, right? This is like, why not play the Mutilation or Celestia riff really slow?
Yeah, which right? is I that's also what I always say, is play the Mutilation riff more. But
yeah, play the Mutilation riff really slow. But like it works here. There's much more. I like, what you said before is true. There's much more specificity to this idea. A lot of those other sort of like 2 or 3 chord ideas, right, are very interchangeable and kind of by design, right? This is a part with its own specific shape, and its own sort of dramatic arc to it. And more than that, like, there's something different about the way it's being played. So this is very much in the triplet mode, the triple time mode that dominates most of this record. However, it's, whereas a lot of it has this kind of over subtle staggered syncopation to it that kind of, is meant to keep it doomy. Here, I think he's just downpicking every chord in the rhythm part.
Well, yeah, and there's also just an odd, like, swing timing thing going on. Yeah, this little almost like Scotch snap thing, dun 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 dun. Okay,
yeah. Obviously. So there's so it's heavily swung, but it's not doing this kind of like subdividing thing he does elsewhere on the record.
Yeah,
and he's just like hitting the downbeat. He's just down picking hard, and it creates this sort of. And there's enough reverb on it that each repetition stacks, right? And where a reverby doom metal band might just let a chord ring, right? Here, each of those chords is ringing out over the one after it. So the riff really accumulates weight as it goes, because there just start to be more and more echoes stacking. And that's heavy and cool. Here again, the picking is kind of post-hardcore-y too.
It's interesting. There's a whole melange of different techniques being explored on this record, and I think that can be both a strength and a weakness at times.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm thinking of by post-hardcore, I mean like ISIS.
Yeah,
like some of the best moments on this record that have this kind of like tech. Almost black metal-y sort of ringing chording with like free-moving driving bass lines and stuff like that, right? And sort of death growls. That's like old ISIS.
Yeah, it's oceanic.
Yeah. So, let's go to later in Bane of Hattusa. And I guess here's a place where I've sort of complained that this band isn't necessarily using the rhythmic space, isn't using the rhythmic opportunities available to them within these more spacious slow tempos. Here's a place where they start generating more rhythmic contrast and also doing that kind of heavy chord stacking stuff we just heard in Death Metal Guy's sample. And this is, toward the climax of the song in the album, and here it really works, and it's quite heavy. So yeah, there you can hear them sort of go from their usual sort of very deliberately restrained triplet feel to just a more typical swinging, grooving, heavy 6/8 kind of thing, right? Or even kind of like noise rocky, like standard noise rock syncopations. It's not. It's very much like certain kinds of standard grooves and even kind of standard riff forms, but it works, and it's high contrast with what's around it.